My boyfriend looked around the dinner table and said, "Honestly, you're not the woman I thought you were." My mother froze. My grandmother stopped eating. I smiled, pulled out my phone, and said, "Funny." I was about to say the exact same thing. 3 days earlier, I'd found the voicemail he'd left begging his ex-girlfriend for another chance. "My name is Elena Carter. I'm 28 years old, and a few weeks ago, I thought my life was moving in exactly the direction I wanted. I worked as a union electrician, which isn't the kind of job people brag about on social media, but it paid well, came with good benefits, and gave me a sense of pride at the end of the day. My truck was paid off, I had money in savings, and if everything stayed on track, I planned to buy my first house within the next couple of years. I wasn't rich, I wasn't flashy, but I was stable, and that mattered to me. For 14 months, I thought my boyfriend, Adrian Walker, respected that. We met at a summer cookout through mutual friends and hit it off almost immediately. Things moved quickly after that. Within 6 months, he had moved into my apartment, and for a while I genuinely believed we were building a future together. Looking back, the warning signs were there long before everything exploded. The problem was that none of them looked serious at first. They usually showed up as jokes, casual comments, or little observations that seemed harmless at the time. Adrian would make fun of my truck and tell me I'd look better driving something newer. He'd compare my lifestyle to people he followed online, people who owned businesses, traveled constantly, or posted photos from expensive restaurants and rooftop bars. One night, he looked at me while I was getting ready for dinner and asked if I'd ever considered changing my style. I laughed and asked what was wrong with the clothes I was wearing. "Nothing's wrong with them," he said. The pause before he continued told me otherwise. "They just don't really stand out. That's because they're work clothes. You know what I mean." At the time, I let it go. Just like I let go of the comments about my career, the remarks about ambition, and the subtle digs he occasionally made about my family. Every relationship has rough patches, and I kept telling myself that was all it was. Around the same time, I started noticing something else. Adrian was always polite around my family, but he never seemed comfortable with them. He smiled, joined conversations, and said all the right things, yet there was always a distance there, like he was observing rather than participating. I noticed it most during family gatherings. My parents loved having everyone together. My older sister and her husband lived nearby. My younger brother came by whenever he could, and my grandmother never missed an excuse to visit. Family dinners were a big deal to us. The dinner that ended my relationship started like every other family dinner. It was my mother's birthday, and the evening felt exactly like every family gathering we'd ever had. Pot roast in the oven, my father telling the same jokes he'd been telling for years, my sister teasing my brother, and my grandmother asking questions nobody else was brave enough to ask. For most of the evening, everything felt normal. People were laughing. Plates were being passed around the table. My mother looked happy, which was really the entire point of the night. Then my grandmother looked at Adrian and me and asked when she was finally getting another wedding to attend. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. "Give us some time, Grandma." She pointed her fork at us. That's what people always say right before they get engaged. The table laughed again. Everyone except Adrian. I noticed it immediately. He wasn't smiling. He was staring down at his plate. Something about that bothered me, although I couldn't explain why. A few seconds later, he looked up and said, "Honestly, I'm not even sure we're headed in that direction." The laughter disappeared instantly. My mother tried to smooth things over. "Oh, every couple moves at their own pace." "It's not really about pace," Adrian replied. The way he said it made my stomach tighten. There was something deliberate about it, like he'd already had this conversation in his head. My father put his fork down. "What do you mean?" Adrian glanced at me before answering. "I guess I thought Elena had more potential when we first started dating." Nobody spoke. My younger brother stopped eating. My sister looked from Adrian to me and back again. I honestly thought he might realize how bad this sounded and stop talking. Instead, he kept going. He went after my job, my truck, and the entire lifestyle I'd worked hard to build. I honestly thought she'd be further along. He said I lacked ambition because I wasn't trying to start my own company. He said I was too comfortable doing the same work year after year. He said he expected more from someone approaching 30. The worst part wasn't what he said. It was where he said it. He said all of that in front of my parents, my grandmother, my siblings, and the same people who had welcomed him into the family without hesitation. The room grew quieter with every sentence. My mother stared down at her plate, my father had stopped eating entirely, and even my grandmother looked like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Meanwhile, Adrian seemed completely unaware of how badly this was going. Or maybe he knew and just didn't care. At some point, I stopped listening, not because I wasn't hearing him, because my mind had gone somewhere else. 3 days earlier, I had been looking up a recipe on Adrian's iPad while he was in the shower. Our devices were always around each other, and I wasn't searching for anything suspicious. Then a voicemail notification appeared on the screen. At first, I ignored it. Then I noticed who it involved. His ex-girlfriend. I wish I could say I looked away. I didn't. The transcription was right there in front of me. The first sentence made my stomach drop. He told her he'd been thinking about her, and by the time he admitted he missed what they had, I was already trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. By the time I reached the end, my stomach had completely sunk. There wasn't. He had asked if she'd be willing to meet for coffee. He told her he'd be open to trying again. That night, after he fell asleep, I checked the voicemail itself. The recording matched the transcription perfectly. I listened to it more than once because part of me couldn't believe it was real. Eventually, I sent a copy to myself and saved it. Not because I planned to use it, at least not then. I just needed proof that I wasn't imagining what I'd heard. Now, sitting at my mother's birthday dinner, while Adrian explained why I wasn't enough for him, I realized something. The voicemail hadn't been a misunderstanding. It explained a lot of things I'd been trying to ignore for months. He wasn't talking to his ex because he was confused. He was talking to his ex because he was already looking beyond our relationship. Across the table, Adrian was still talking. Eventually, he stopped and looked at me. I think he expected an argument. Maybe tears, maybe an apology. Instead, I pulled out my phone. The change in his expression was immediate. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm giving everyone some context." The room went completely silent. My mother frowned. "What context?" I never took my eyes off Adrian. "The voicemail you left for your ex-girlfriend." His face lost color so quickly it was almost shocking. "Elena, don't." My father looked between us. "Don't what?" Nobody answered him. I unlocked my phone. Adrian pushed back from the table. "We should talk about this privately." I almost laughed. A few minutes earlier, he'd been comfortable criticizing me in front of my entire family. Apparently, privacy mattered now. I set the phone on the table. My mother looked confused. My sister looked concerned. My grandmother leaned forward. I pressed play. The room filled with Adrian's voice. The first sentence was enough. By the second, nobody was eating anymore. By the third, my father was staring directly at him. And when the recording reached the part where he admitted he'd be willing to try again with his ex, the entire room froze. The voicemail ended. Nobody spoke. My mother's fork slipped from her hand and hit the plate with a loud metallic clatter. My father slowly stood up. "Is that your voice?" Adrian tried to explain. Tried to say it wasn't what it sounded like. Nobody bought it. Not after what we'd just heard. Not after the speech he'd spent the last 10 minutes giving about me. My sister finally broke the silence. "So you tell Elena she's not enough, and at the same time you're calling your ex, asking for another chance?" Adrian didn't answer. He couldn't. For the first time all evening, he had nothing to say. My father pointed toward the front door. "I think it's time for you to leave." The drive back to my apartment that night felt longer than usual. Maybe because I was exhausted. Maybe because I knew the relationship was over, even if neither of us had officially said the words. By the time I unlocked my front door, all I wanted was silence. Instead, I walked into an apartment full of reminders. Adrian's shoes were still by the door. His jacket was hanging where he'd left it that morning. His coffee mug was still sitting in the sink. Everywhere I looked, there was evidence that only a few hours earlier I'd believed we were building a future together. I sat on the couch for a while, staring at the dark television screen, trying to process how quickly everything had fallen apart. That's when my phone buzzed. The message was from Adrian. I honestly thought it might be an apology. It wasn't. "You had no right to do that." That was the entire text. No acknowledgement of the voicemail. No apology for humiliating me in front of my family. No explanation. Just anger. I stared at the message for a few seconds before locking my phone and setting it down. Strangely, that text hurt less than it would have a week earlier. By that point, I wasn't questioning whether I'd done the right thing. The bigger question was why he'd been so comfortable humiliating me in front of my family, and yet expected protection when the attention shifted back to him. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, another memory surfaced. Conversations I'd brushed off, comments I'd excused, moments that felt different now that I knew what was happening behind my back. The next morning, I went to work and tried to focus on my job. Around lunchtime, my neighbor texted me. "Everything okay over there?" I frowned and asked why. His reply came almost immediately. "Your boyfriend's been in and out all morning. Sounds like he's tearing the place apart." A knot formed in my stomach. I spent the rest of the afternoon distracted, checking my phone more than I should have and counting down the hours until I could get home. The moment I opened the apartment door, I knew something had changed. Most of Adrian's clothes were gone. The bathroom shelves were half empty. Several drawers had been cleared out. At first, I felt relieved. If he was moving out, Maybe we could both move on and be done with it. Then I walked into the guest room. The television was gone. I stopped and stared at the empty wall. For a second, I genuinely thought there had to be some explanation. There wasn't. The 55-inch Samsung I'd bought years before meeting Adrian had disappeared. A quick look around confirmed something else was missing too. My JBL speaker. The same one I'd owned since college. I pulled out my phone and texted him immediately. "Did you take my TV and speaker?" His response came less than a minute later. "Consider it compensation for emotional damages." I actually laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny. Because it was so absurd that I didn't know how else to react. I told him to return them. He replied with a single word. "No." That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a breakup and started seeing it as a problem that would need documentation. I gave him 48 hours to return my property before I filed a police report. He read the message and ignored it. 2 days later, nothing had changed. The TV was still missing. The speaker was still missing, and Adrian still wasn't responding. During my lunch break, I went to the police station. The officer I spoke with was polite but realistic. Property disputes involving former couples were messy, especially when both people had lived in the same residence. Fortunately, I had receipts. Both items had been purchased through my Amazon account long before Adrian entered my life. The officer looked over everything and explained that while a report could be filed, recovering the property might ultimately become a civil matter. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but at least there was now documentation. I thought that would be the biggest problem. I was wrong. A few days later, I started noticing something strange. Friends who normally answered messages right away suddenly became distant. One mutual friend stopped responding altogether. Another seemed oddly cold during a conversation that would have been completely normal a week earlier. The first real clue came when one of our mutual friends called me. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, she finally asked the question she'd obviously been building toward. "Did you go through Adrian's devices?" The question caught me off guard. "What?" She hesitated. "He said you've been controlling for a while." The more she talked, the clearer the picture became. Adrian had started telling people his version of events. According to him, I had invaded his privacy. I had become obsessive. I had publicly humiliated him. According to Adrian, the voicemail was being taken out of context and he was only looking for closure. That explanation would have been a lot easier to believe if the recording hadn't included him asking whether she'd be willing to try again. I listened quietly while she explained everything she'd heard. When she finished, I asked one simple question. "Did he tell you what he said to me at my mother's birthday dinner before I played the voicemail?" Silence. I already knew the answer. I followed it with another question. "Did he tell you he took my TV and speaker?" More silence. The conversation ended shortly after that. What frustrated me most wasn't what Adrian was saying. It was how many people were willing to accept it without asking a single question. Some of these people had known me for years, yet all it took was one emotional story from him, and suddenly they weren't sure what to believe. I stopped trying to convince everyone. Anyone who genuinely cared would eventually ask for both sides. Anyone who didn't wasn't worth chasing. About a week after the dinner, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have ignored it. For some reason, I answered. The woman on the other end sounded nervous. "You don't know me," she said, "but I think we should talk." I asked who she was. There was a brief pause before she answered. "Lauren." The name didn't register immediately. Then it hit me. She was Adrian's ex-girlfriend, the same woman from the voicemail. I sat up a little straighter. Out of all the people I expected to hear from after the breakup, she wasn't one of them. I honestly had no idea why she was calling, and part of me expected the conversation to go badly. Instead, the first thing she said was, "I heard what happened." I wasn't sure what to say. Before I could respond, she sighed and added, "He's doing the same thing to you, isn't he?" That sentence got my attention immediately. "What do you mean?" For the next 20 minutes, Lauren told me things that sounded disturbingly familiar. The constant criticism. The comparisons. The way every disagreement somehow became someone else's fault. The habit of rewriting events afterward to make himself look like the victim. She wasn't trying to convince me to hate him. She wasn't being dramatic. If anything, she sounded tired. Like she'd already lived through this and had no interest in doing it again. Before we hung up, she gave me one piece of advice. Save everything. What? Texts, emails, screenshots, anything important. I asked why. There was a pause before she answered. Because when Adrian feels cornered, he gets desperate. At the time, I thought she might be exaggerating. A week later, I realized she wasn't. If anything, she was warning me too gently. Because Adrian wasn't done causing problems. And the next move he made would turn an ugly breakup into something much bigger. Lauren was right. I didn't realize how right she was until a few days later. At first, the damage seemed limited to gossip. Adrian was telling anyone who would listen that I'd violated his privacy and humiliated him in front of my family. It was annoying, but I figured eventually people would get tired of hearing about it. Instead, things escalated. One afternoon, a mutual friend forwarded me a social media post Adrian had made. He didn't use my name, but he didn't need to. Anyone who knew us could tell exactly who he was talking about. The post was full of vague references to emotional abuse, toxic relationships, and partners who monitored private conversations. Predictably, people flooded the comments with support. A few even messaged me directly. Most weren't asking questions. They were making assumptions. At first, I wanted to defend myself publicly. I wanted to post screenshots, explain the timeline, and point out everything he conveniently left out of his version. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that was exactly what he wanted. An argument. A public fight. Another opportunity to paint himself as the victim. So I stayed quiet. Instead, I contacted 3 mutual friends who seemed most convinced by his story. I didn't send a long explanation. I didn't ask them to choose sides. I simply gave them information. Screenshots of messages where Adrian mocked my family's house. Messages where he complained that visiting them felt like charity work. Messages where he called my truck embarrassing. Messages where he wished I made more money so he wouldn't have to pretend to enjoy my lifestyle. I also sent the voicemail and the text where he admitted taking my TV and speaker as compensation for emotional damages. That was all I sent. No speech, no argument. Just enough facts for them to decide whether Adrian had been honest. The reaction was interesting. 2 people stopped responding entirely. One called me later that evening. The first thing she said was, "He never showed us any of that." Of course he hadn't, because none of it helped his story. She apologized for believing everything she'd heard and admitted Adrian had recently been out asking friends for money because he was struggling after moving out. Apparently, several people had already helped him. The more I learned, the more familiar the pattern started to look. Every setback was somebody else's fault. Every consequence became evidence that he'd been wronged. Meanwhile, Lauren and I stayed in occasional contact. We weren't becoming friends exactly, but we understood something about each other that very few people did. We both dated the same man. We'd both watched him rewrite reality when things didn't go his way. About a week after our first conversation, Lauren called me again. This time she sounded frustrated. "He's been contacting me nonstop." I sat up immediately. What happened? "He won't leave me alone." According to Lauren, the voicemail I'd discovered hadn't been the beginning of his attempts to reconnect. It was only the first one I'd found. Since the breakup, he'd been calling, texting, and showing up unexpectedly at places he knew she frequented. She'd already told him she wasn't interested. More than once. He ignored it. Eventually, she blocked him. That should have ended the situation. It didn't. A few days later, Adrian showed up outside her apartment. Lauren refused to let him inside. What happened next ended up becoming the turning point in everything. When Adrian realized she wasn't going to help him, his attitude changed. The apologetic version of Adrian disappeared almost immediately. In its place came the same anger, frustration, and blame Lauren and I had both seen before whenever things stopped going his way. Lauren had the presence of mind to start recording the conversation on her phone. At the time, she did it because she felt uncomfortable. Later, that recording became one of the most important pieces of evidence either of us had. She played part of it for me over the phone. I still remember sitting in my kitchen listening to it. Adrian's voice was unmistakable. At first he was pleading. Then he was bargaining. Then he was threatening. "If you don't help me," he said, "people are going to hear some things about you." Lauren asked him what he meant. There was a pause. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. "I'll figure something out." She asked what exactly he planned to tell people. His answer was chilling because of how casually he said it. It worked before. The recording ended shortly after that. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. We both knew exactly what he meant. The same accusations he'd been making about me. The same story he'd been spreading to mutual friends. He wasn't talking about something that might happen. He was talking about something he'd already done. Lauren sent me a copy of the recording that night. I saved it in multiple places. By that point, my phone contained screenshots, texts, voicemails, receipts, police reports, basically everything connected to Adrian and the mess he'd created. A few days later, I learned why keeping records mattered. My landlord called while I was at work. At first, I assumed it was something routine. It wasn't. Apparently, Adrian had contacted him and claimed he didn't feel safe around me. According to his story, I'd become unstable after the breakup, and he was trying to have me removed from the lease. I actually laughed when my landlord told me, not because it was funny, Because it was ridiculous. My landlord had known me for years. I'd never missed rent, never caused problems, never received a complaint. Fortunately, he wasn't interested in acting on unsupported accusations. He told Adrian the same thing he'd told me months earlier. If either tenant wanted changes to the lease, there needed to be documentation. Adrian didn't have any, because nothing he claimed had happened. The irony was that he could have removed himself from the lease at any point. The paperwork was ready. He refused to sign it. He didn't want out. He wanted me out. That conversation finally convinced me that this situation wasn't going to fix itself. A few days later, I texted Adrian and asked if he'd meet me at a coffee shop. He agreed almost immediately. The speed of his response surprised me. Looking back, I think he assumed I was reaching out to make peace. Maybe he thought I was tired of fighting. Maybe he thought I was ready to apologize. Whatever he expected, it wasn't what happened. When I arrived, he was already there. He actually smiled when he saw me. That smile disappeared within 10 minutes. I sat down and got straight to the point. Adrian started interrupting almost immediately. "You're blowing this way out of proportion." "Am I?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're the one who stole my property, lied about me, tried to turn our friends against me, and then attempted to get me removed from my own lease." He opened his mouth again, but I didn't let him take over the conversation. For once, I wasn't there to debate feelings. I had facts. Finally, I told him there was one more thing he needed to know. Lauren had recorded their conversation outside her apartment. The moment I mentioned it, all the confidence drained from his face. He knew exactly which recording I meant. For the first time since the breakup, I watched him run out of excuses. I laid out a simple offer: return my property, sign the lease release, stop spreading stories about me, and we could both walk away from this mess. He sat there quietly for a long time, long enough for me to realize he was calculating, trying to figure out whether I was bluffing. I wasn't. Eventually, he asked the only question that mattered. "What happens if I don't?" I looked at him. "Then people get the full story." Another long silence followed. Finally, he nodded. The fight left him all at once. Within a few days, my TV and speaker were back in my apartment. The lease release was signed. My landlord confirmed everything had been processed. Just like that, the practical part of the nightmare was over. The TV was back, the lease was fixed, and for the first time in weeks, my phone wasn't lighting up with some new disaster. The emotional part took longer. 14 months isn't a short relationship. You don't walk away from that without carrying some scars. For a while, I kept replaying things in my head, wondering how long he'd been unhappy and how many warning signs I'd ignored. Eventually, I stopped asking those questions. They didn't change anything. What mattered was that I knew the truth now. My family stood by me. The friends who mattered eventually learned what really happened. Lauren moved on with her life, and Adrian lost the ability to control the story he'd worked so hard to create. A few weeks later, my mother called and asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. "Just family. Nothing special." I said yes. When I walked through that front door, everything felt normal again. My father was watching a game. My brother was arguing about something unimportant. My grandmother was criticizing everyone's cooking. The same people who had been sitting around that table the night everything fell apart were still there. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that feeling until I was sitting there again. Looking around that table, I couldn't help noticing that nothing important had really changed. The people who mattered had been there before Adrian came into my life, and they were still there after he left. Losing Adrian felt devastating at the time. Looking back, it was probably the best thing that could have happened to me.